Tonight, we return to a case that earned a lasting place in British policing history and has never quite faded from it. One woman, one investigation. One institutional aftermath that reshaped the way England pursued its killers. The story of Jane Jones begins in Roehampton, Surrey, during the spring of 1842. Roehampton at that time was a prosperous village situated southwest of London, separated from the urban sprawl by open fields, market gardens, and the sprawling grounds of the large, private residences that wealthy merchants and landowners had established along its main lanes in the decades prior. The village had not yet been swallowed by the city. Its character in 1842 remained semi-rural. Wide thoroughfares, grand estates with long carriage drives and detached stables, and a population of domestic servants, gardeners, coachmen, and household staff employed by those who maintained substantial country properties, while keeping their commercial interests in London. Putney Park Lane, cutting through the southern parts of Roehampton, was lined with precisely such properties. The estate of Queely Sheil, a wealthy plantation owner originally hailing from Montserrat, occupied a sizable stretch of the lane. Its grounds included a house, various outbuildings, and a stable block set some distance from the main residence. It was within that stable block that Jane Jones's case first entered the official record, and it was from those same premises that a man would slip away on the night of Wednesday, the 6th of April, 1842, setting off a chain of events that would alter British policing for the rest of the century. The historical record remains almost entirely mute on Jane Jones as an individual prior to the events of 1842. What can be stated with confidence, based on the surviving sources, is limited to a narrow set of documented facts. Her date of birth does not appear in any primary source recovered. Her place of birth is unrecorded. The names of her parents are absent. Her early circumstances, her employment prior to the relationship that eventually brought her to Roehampton, and the specific route by which she arrived in London, are all missing from the surviving documentation. She emerges into the documented world around October of 1839, when she took lodging at number 18 South Street, in the district of Manchester Square, London. That address was a boarding house of the sort that housed the working poor and those in domestic service. A place of modest means, not destitute, but without particular distinction. Beyond these bare facts, the record offers nothing of her earlier life. What is documented is her appearance, as recalled by those who knew her, and testified to that knowledge during the proceedings after her death. Witnesses described her as a plump person and rather dark in complexion. No further physical description appears in the surviving record. No documents relating to her education, her religious observance, or her social connections prior to 1839 have been located. She enters the record solely as a lodger on a particular street in a particular year, and in no other capacity before her death. Shortly after taking her lodgings at Manchester Square, Jane Jones entered into a domestic arrangement with a man named Daniel Good. The precise circumstances under which they met are not recorded in the sources recovered. Within roughly 6 months of her arrival at South Street, she had begun to use the name Jane Good, adopting his surname in the fashion common among working-class couples who cohabited without the legal formality of marriage. Such arrangements were neither unusual nor remarkable in the London of 1839 and 1840. Legal marriage was costly and administratively burdensome for those without means. The adoption of a partner's surname provided social clarity even without legal standing. Jane Jones lived under the name Jane Good for approximately 3 years before her death. She is charged in the court record under that alias. She is known to history by her birth name. If you appreciate stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the Litany of Sleeves, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. Now, back to the record. Daniel Good was employed at the time of his relationship with Jane Jones as a coachman to Queely Sheil at the Putney Park Lane estate in Roehampton. He had held that position for just over 2 years by the spring of 1842. His responsibilities centered on the management of the ponies that drew Sheil's 4-wheel chaise and on the maintenance of the stable block and associated outbuildings. The coachman occupied a particular niche within the domestic service hierarchy, responsible and trusted with the care of valuable horses and vehicles, and enjoying a degree of autonomy over the stable precincts that set him apart from household servants who worked under closer supervision inside the main house. Daniel Good's access to and authority over the stable block at the Sheil estate was a product of his professional role. The buildings were his domain, and what occurred within them at night was, in practice, largely beyond the observation of those in the main house. Good was Irish-born, described in contemporaneous accounts as an Irish coachman. He stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a very dark complexion, long features, and black hair. He was notably bald at the crown of his head, a physical feature that would prove significant in the weeks to come. His domestic situation at the time of his employment with Sheil was complicated by the existence of a legal wife, known in the record only as Molly, from whom he was estranged and who lived at an address in Spitalfields in the east of the city. Good used his estranged wife's address for certain purposes while conducting his domestic life with Jane Jones at and near the Roehampton estate. No documentation relating to Molly's full name or the precise circumstances of the estrangement has been identified in the sources recovered. The marriage was a legal fact, and its existence meant that Jane Jones could not be Good's lawful wife, regardless of the name she used or the domestic arrangements she maintained. The relationship between Jane Jones and Daniel Good had been ongoing for approximately 3 years by the opening months of 1842. During that period, they had lived in close proximity, she under his adopted surname, he presenting her publicly as his wife. By early 1842, however, Good had turned his attentions toward a third party. Lydia Susanna Butcher was approximately 30 years of age, a single woman residing with her parents in the town of Woolwich, southeast of London. The nature of any prior connection between Good and Lydia Susanna Butcher is not established in the sources recovered. What the subsequent trial record documents is that Good had recently directed his attentions toward her, and that this had introduced friction into his domestic arrangement with Jane Jones. Whether he intended to pursue a formal relationship with Lydia Susanna Butcher, or to seek some form of remarriage following a separation from Jane Jones, is not definitively established in the documentation. What the trial record reflects is that the relationship with Lydia Susanna Butcher was a material element in the motive subsequently attributed to Good for the killing of Jane Jones. Some accounts of the case also state that Jane Jones may have been with child at the time of her death. This detail appears in a number of secondary sources and is not uniformly confirmed across the primary materials. It should be understood as contested rather than established, and it is treated accordingly in what follows. The last known movements of Jane Jones before her death are not preserved in any documentary source recovered from the period. The date of the killing, on or about the 3rd of April 1842, was Easter Sunday. The examining surgeon who later inspected the remains would determine that death had occurred 3 to 4 days prior to his examination on the 7th of April, placing the date of death in the range of the 3rd to the 4th of April. The 3rd of April is the date accepted in the secondary literature. What Jane Jones was doing on that day, and whether she had any awareness of the danger she was in, are questions the record does not answer. No witness testimony documents her final hours. No statement attributed to her survives. The year 1842 in England was a year of significant social and economic hardship. The country was in the second year of what contemporaries would come to call the Hungry Forties. The economy was depressed. Wages had fallen across the manufacturing districts, and unemployment was widespread. Chartism was at its height. The second Chartist petition was presented to Parliament in May of 1842, within days of Good's trial at the Old Bailey. Into this atmosphere, the case of Jane Jones intruded as a subject of intense public attention, principally for what it revealed about the capacity of the metropolitan authorities to pursue a murderer who had the presence of mind to cross a parish boundary. The Metropolitan Police had been established by Sir Robert Peel in 1829, only 13 years prior to the events of April 1842. It was a force still finding its operational form. Its jurisdiction was administered through a series of divisions, each responsible for a defined geographic area within the Metropolitan Police District. There was no plainclothes detective capacity within the force. The concept of detective work, of officers pursuing investigations through the accumulation of evidence across divisional lines, was regarded with public suspicion. The association in the popular mind between such methods and the spy police tradition of France made the establishment of a formal detective branch a matter of considerable political sensitivity. The force, comprising approximately 800 uniformed constables spread over a 15-mile circuit of the city, was structured for the prevention of crime on the beat, not for the investigation of crime across administrative boundaries. The consequences of that structural arrangement would become apparent in the weeks following the discovery of what lay beneath the hay in the stable at Putney Park Lane. The crime itself occurred within those stable precincts, most probably on the evening or night of Easter Sunday, the 3rd of April, 1842. The precise sequence of events inside the stable on that night is not documented in the surviving record with a degree of certainty that permits confident narration of every step. What the subsequent medical examination established was that Jane Jones died by violence, that the killing occurred at or near the stable block, and that the acts committed in the aftermath were carried out by the same hand that had killed her. The method of the killing is described in some secondary accounts as a beating, possibly involving a heavy implement. This description is not confirmed with certainty by the primary materials available, and it is presented here with the qualification the evidence requires. What the medical record does establish, with the authority of the examining surgeon's testimony, is that Jane Jones was dead before any further acts were committed against her remains. Following her death, Daniel Good dismembered the body. The head was separated from the torso. The arms and legs were separated from the torso. The stomach had been opened. Good then attempted to burn the remains within the stable itself. The attempt was only partially successful. The torso survived the burning in a condition that permitted subsequent identification and examination. Good concealed what remained beneath hay within the stable. He secured the stable buildings, resumed the ordinary conduct of his employment, and waited. He waited for 3 days. On the evening of the 6th of April, his wait ended through no action of any investigating officer, but through the unrelated complaint of a pawnbroker in Wandsworth High Street about a missing pair of black trousers. The chain of events that followed from that complaint is, in its particulars, one of the more remarkable accidental discoveries in the history of English criminal investigation. A pawnbroker in Wandsworth High Street had recently noticed the theft of a pair of black trousers from his premises. The item was of modest value. On the evening of Wednesday, the 6th of April, 1842, Police Constable William Gardner of V Division, Metropolitan Police, was conducting his regular patrol of Wandsworth High Street when the report was made to him. Two young assistants employed at the pawnbroker's shop accompanied P.C. Gardner on the errand that followed. Together, the three men walked approximately 2 miles from Wandsworth to the Sheil estate on Putney Park Lane, arriving at the premises at approximately 9:30 in the evening. The estate buildings were closed for the night. P.C. Gardner entered the stable block and conducted a search of the premises by the light available to him. He was looking for a pair of stolen trousers. He was not looking for anything else. The stable was occupied in the ordinary way. Hay stacked in the stalls, the smell of horses, the closed darkness of an outbuilding at the end of an April evening. In the course of his search, Gardner's attention was drawn to something beneath a quantity of hay. He initially believed it to be a plucked goose. On closer examination, the object beneath the hay was not a goose. It was the headless, limbless torso of a woman. The constable had found the remains of Jane Jones. At the moment P.C. Gardner made this discovery, Daniel Good was present in the stable. Good moved immediately. He passed through the stable door, drew it shut behind him, and secured it from the outside, leaving Gardner and the two young men from the pawnbroker's shop locked within the stable building. The three men were enclosed in a locked-out building in the dark, in the grounds of an estate 2 miles from the nearest station, with the partial remains of a murdered woman at their feet. They were eventually able to force their way free and raise the alarm. By the time they did so, Daniel Good had gained a significant lead. The discovery on the evening of the 6th of April, 1842, ended the concealment. It did not end the matter. Good was gone, and the machinery available to bring him back was, as events would demonstrate, entirely inadequate to the task. 9 divisions of the Metropolitan Police were set in motion following the alarm raised by P.C. Gardner and his companions. Officers fanned outward from the Sheil estate in the immediate hours following the discovery. The search extended through the night and into the following days. Those directing the effort were working with no specialist detective capacity, no plainclothes investigative apparatus, and no mechanism for transmitting coordinated intelligence across the administrative boundaries that divided the Metropolitan Police district into its constituent divisions. They were also working against the fundamental reality that Good had crossed, or was in the process of crossing, those boundaries almost immediately after his departure from the estate. Commissioner Richard Maine, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, called in Inspector Nicholas Pearce from a division. Inspector Pearce was the officer within the Metropolitan Police judged best qualified for the management of cases of this nature. His involvement gave the pursuit a degree of senior direction, but it did not resolve the structural problem. Good was consistently 1 day ahead of his pursuers. The trail led from the Sheil estate at Roehampton to Spitalfields, where Good had connections through the address of his estranged wife Molly. From Spitalfields, investigators traced his route southeast toward Deptford, and from Deptford toward Bromley. At Bromley, the trail passed beyond the boundary of the Metropolitan Police District and into the county of Kent. Once Good had crossed that line, the Metropolitan Police had, in the words of the memorandum that would subsequently be drafted in response to this failure, no means of getting immediate cognizance of him. The investigation had extended its reach as far as the administrative structures of 1842 permitted. Beyond that limit, there was nothing. Statements were taken from those who had known Jane Jones, from individuals connected to the estate at Putney Park Lane, and from witnesses who could speak to Good's movements and domestic arrangements in the period before the crime. Those statements established the nature of the relationship between Good and Jane Jones, the existence of Lydia Susanna Butcher in Woolwich, and the domestic history of the household. They established where Jane Jones had lived, under what name she had lived, and the approximate duration of her connection to Good. They did not locate Good. Physical description was published and distributed. Good's appearance was set out in precise terms: 5 feet 6 inches in height, very dark complexion, long features, black hair, notably bald at the crown of the head. This description was circulated through the press and through the official channels available to the police. The Illustrated London News, a new publication that had appeared only weeks earlier, published it with particular prominence. The public was invited to assist in the identification of the fugitive. The publication of Good's description was the principal investigative tool available. It would, in the event, prove to be sufficient, but not through any action of the Metropolitan Police in active pursuit. The investigation had now extended across more than a week without effecting an arrest. The press had taken notice. The Times carried extensive reports on the case throughout the manhunt, covering each development, each sighting, and each failure to apprehend. Public commentary was explicit in its censure of the Metropolitan Police for its inability to pursue a murderer across divisional lines. A force of approximately 800 men spread over a 15-mile circuit of the city, the papers noted, had been bested by a single fugitive with a head start and the presence of mind to keep walking. The reputational damage to the Metropolitan Police, already a force viewed with some suspicion by sections of the public, was considerable. The arrest of Daniel Good did not come through police work in the conventional sense. Good had, during his flight, adopted the alias James Connor. He had traveled through a series of locations across southeast England, passing through a public house in Tonbridge, Kent, known as the Bull, where he gave his assumed name. He subsequently found employment as a laborer on a building site near Tonbridge railway station. He had been working at this site for a period of days when a man working alongside him recognized him. That man was a former police officer who had previously served in Wandsworth, within the Metropolitan Police District, and who had encountered, or had knowledge of, Good from that period of service. The former officer, whose name was not confirmed in the primary sources recovered, informed the superintendent of the Southeastern Railway Police, a man named Humphrey, of what he had observed. Superintendent Humphrey arranged for Good to be brought to the Angel Inn, situated at the corner of Vale Road and High Street in Tunbridge, under the pretext of an offer of refreshments. Good accepted. He entered the Angel Inn and sat by the fire. When he removed his cap, the distinctive bald crown of his head was visible. Superintendent Humphrey arrested him at that point. The alias James Connor was set aside. The fugitive was Daniel Good, and the 10 to 14 days of flight that had confounded 9 divisions of the Metropolitan Police came to an end through the chance recognition of a former Wandsworth officer working on a building site in Kent. Good was returned to London. He maintained his denial of guilt throughout the proceedings that followed. The medical examination of the remains of Jane Jones had been conducted in the days immediately following P.C. Gardner's discovery on the 6th of April. Benjamin Ryde, surgeon at Putney, was directed to conduct the post-mortem examination under the authority of the coroner's warrant. Ryde examined the body on the 7th of April, 1842, one day after the discovery. The state of the remains as presented to Ryde for examination was as follows. The torso was limbless and headless. The dismemberment had separated the head, the arms, and the legs from the main body. The stomach had been opened. Evidence of an attempt at incineration was present on the remains, though the burning had been incomplete and the torso had survived in a condition that permitted examination. Ride determined from the state of decomposition that the body had been dead for 3 to 4 days at the time of his examination. This placed the date of death at approximately the 3rd to the 4th of April, 1842, consistent with the 3rd of April, Easter Sunday, as the date of the killing. Ride further determined that the severance of the head and limbs had been carried out after death rather than before. The heart, when examined, was found to be in a healthy condition, but it was entirely bloodless. These findings were entered into the official record. The post-mortem examination did not establish the cause of death with complete certainty. Given the condition of the remains and the absence of the head and limbs at the time of the initial proceedings, the head of Jane Jones was not recovered in time to inform the early stages of the inquest. The cause of death, on the basis of the material available to the examining surgeon, was recorded in terms consistent with the injuries sustained, though the precise mechanism of death remained incompletely documented in the primary sources that survived. The findings of Benjamin Ride were subsequently entered into the evidence presented at the coroner's inquest and at the trial. They constituted the principal forensic basis for the case against Daniel Good, establishing the fact of death by violence and the post-mortem character of the dismemberment. A coroner's inquest was convened following the discovery of the remains and the completion of the initial medical examination. The proceedings returned a verdict of willful murder against Daniel Good. The inquest established the formal legal basis for the murder charge and committed the matter for further proceedings. Good, by the time the inquest verdict was returned, had been apprehended at Tunbridge and was in custody. He was examined at Bow Street in preliminary proceedings before a magistrate, the existence of which is confirmed by a contemporaneous illustration titled "Examination of Good for the Barbarous Murder of Jane Jones," which records the fact of the Bow Street hearing. Following the magistrate's examination, Good was committed to stand trial at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in the City of London. The committal brought the matter into the formal framework of the highest criminal court in England. The prosecution was assembled. The evidence gathered during the inquest and the investigation, including the medical testimony of Benjamin Ride, the witness statements relating to Jane Jones's domestic history and her connection to Good, and the circumstances of Good's flight and arrest under an alias, was prepared for presentation at trial. The hearing at the Old Bailey was fixed for the May session of 1842. The case had, by the time of Good's committal, generated a level of public interest and press coverage that exceeded that of most criminal proceedings of the period. The Times had followed the matter from the discovery of the body through the manhunt and into the arrest. The Illustrated London News, the recently established illustrated newspaper that had begun publication only in the weeks prior to these events, had given the case prominent coverage. The public was following developments with the sustained attention that the press was both feeding and reflecting. The question of whether Daniel Good would be found guilty of the willful murder of Jane Jones, the woman he had presented to the world as his wife, was a question that London was waiting to have answered. The investigation was now complete in its essential elements. The body had been examined. The inquest had returned its verdict. The suspect was in custody. The committal had been made. What remained was the trial. The trial of Daniel Good commenced at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in London on the 13th of May, 1842, within the session that had opened on the 9th of May. The presiding judge took his place on the bench. The prosecution was conducted by a barrister named Gurney. The charge against Daniel Good was stated as the willful murder of Jane Good, alias Jane Jones. Good entered a plea of not guilty. The court proceeded to the hearing of evidence. The courtroom at the Old Bailey in May of 1842 was not a quiet place. The case had been the subject of sustained press attention for more than a month. The discovery of the torso, the flight of Good, the frustrating progress of the manhunt across divisional boundaries, and the ultimately accidental nature of the arrest had all been reported at length in the newspapers of the city. The Illustrated London News had published Good's portrait in its pages with a prominence that reflected the public appetite for the case. Those who attended the proceedings came with a knowledge of the broad outline of events that was unusual even for a notable criminal trial. The trial itself, by the standards of the evidence available and the legal questions to be resolved, was not a lengthy affair. It concluded within a single day. The prosecution opened its case by setting out the nature of the charge and the principal evidence by which it intended to establish Good's guilt. The argument proceeded through several distinct bodies of evidence. The first was the discovery itself. The constable's visit to the stable at Putney Park Lane on the 6th of April, the finding of the torso beneath the hay, and the conduct of Good in locking Gardner, and the two shop assistants inside the stable and departing at that moment. This sequence of events, the prosecution argued, was entirely consistent with the conduct of a man who knew what lay beneath that hay and who had placed it there himself. The second body of evidence concerned the domestic history of the household and the relationship between Daniel Good and Jane Jones. Witnesses were called who could speak to Jane Jones's residence under the name Jane Good, her presence at or near the Putney Park Lane estate, and her connection to Daniel Good over the preceding 3 years. Testimony was given relating to her lodgings at Manchester Square, to the manner in which she had been presented by Good as his wife, and to the fact that a boy of approximately 8 years of age, named Daniel Good, had been connected to the household. The evidence established the existence of the relationship, the domestic arrangement in which Jane Jones had lived, and the setting within which the crime had occurred. The third body of evidence was the medical testimony of Benjamin Ryde. The surgeon was called to the stand and gave his findings from the post-mortem examination conducted on the 7th of April. Ryde testified to the state of the remains, the limbless and headless torso, the open stomach, the evidence of attempted burning, and the determination that the dismemberment had been carried out after death. He gave his opinion on the time of death, placing it at 3 to 4 days before his examination, consistent with the 3rd of April. The heart, he testified, had been in a healthy condition, but was entirely without blood, a finding that he set before the court as part of his account of what the remains disclosed. These findings were entered into the record and went to the jury as the principal forensic basis for the prosecution's case. The fourth element of the prosecution's case was the conduct of the defendant following the discovery. Good had fled the estate at the moment of P.C. Gardner's discovery, locking those present inside the stable to gain time. He had then traveled from Roehampton to Spitalfields, thence to Deptford, thence to Bromley, and on into Kent, assuming the alias James Connor and finding employment on a building site near Tunbridge Station. His arrest had come only through the chance recognition of a former police officer working at the same site. The prosecution presented the sequence of flight, concealment, and the assumption of a false identity as conduct consistent with guilt and inconsistent with any innocent explanation of the circumstances in which the body of Jane Jones had come to be found beneath the hay in the stable over which Good had charge. The defense did not challenge the evidence of the discovery or the medical findings. Good's position, as it emerged in the proceedings, was not that Jane Jones had not died in the stable, nor that her body had not been found there. His position was that he had not killed her. The specific argument he advanced was that Jane Jones had taken her own life, and that the conduct of Lydia Susanna Butcher had been the cause of her doing so. The medical evidence did not support this claim. The post-mortem findings, as testified to by Benjamin Ride, were inconsistent with suicide as the cause of death. The jury was asked to accept an account that the evidence before the court did not sustain. Witnesses called during the proceedings also spoke to the existence of Lydia Susanna Butcher as a presence in Good's recent life, and to the friction that her existence had introduced into his arrangement with Jane Jones. The emerging picture was of a man who had wished to be free of one domestic connection in order to pursue another, and who had resolved the difficulty through the killing and subsequent disposal of the woman who stood in his way. The jury retired to deliberate following the conclusion of the evidence and the addresses of counsel. The deliberation was brief. Contemporary press reports described it as lasting approximately half an hour, with one account placing the duration at 35 minutes. The brevity was noted in the newspaper coverage of the day. The jury returned to the court and delivered its verdict. The verdict was guilty. The conviction was entered into the record of the Central Criminal Court. The prosecution's case, resting on the combined weight of the discovery, the medical findings, the domestic history, and the conduct of the defendant in flight, had been accepted by the jury in its entirety. The defense argument that Jane Jones had taken her own life was not accepted. The evidence had not supported it, and the jury had not found it persuasive. Following the return of the verdict, Daniel Good addressed the court at length. He spoke without invitation, making a substantial declaration in which he maintained his innocence, repudiated the verdict, and placed responsibility for the death of Jane Jones upon Lydia Susanna Butcher. He stated, in terms that occupied a considerable portion of the court's time, that Butcher's conduct toward Jane Jones had driven the latter to take her own life, and that he bore no responsibility for what had occurred. This speech was reported in the press. It was not accepted by the court, by the public commentators who addressed the case, or by any subsequent examination of the evidence. Good's declaration was the final statement he made before the proceedings moved to their conclusion. The judge donned the black cap. The sentence was pronounced. Daniel Good was condemned to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. The sentence was to be carried out at Newgate Prison. The verdict and sentence were entered in the record of the Central Criminal Court. The case had been placed before a jury within a month and a week of Good's arrest at Tunbridge, and within 5 weeks of the discovery of the torso at the Sheil estate. The proceedings had moved with the pace that the evidence and the law permitted. The question of what had become of Jane Jones was now answered in legal terms. The question of what would follow from her death in institutional terms was only beginning. Press reaction to the verdict was extensive. The Times carried detailed reports of the trial proceedings on the days following their conclusion. The coverage was not limited to the bare facts of the verdict. It extended to commentary on the nature of the crime, on Good's conduct throughout, and on the extraordinary sequence of events by which a stolen pair of trousers had led a constable to a stable and brought one of the most widely reported murder cases of the decade to the attention of the public. The newspapers that had followed the manhunt across its full duration now followed the verdict and the anticipated execution with the same sustained attention. The public, which had tracked each stage of the pursuit through the press, was now awaiting the final proceeding. Among those who had known Jane Jones, the verdict brought to a close the formal question of what had happened to her. What it did not bring to a close was the broader question. The case had exposed the question of whether the Metropolitan Police, as constituted in 1842, was capable of performing the investigative function that the public reasonably expected of it. That question had been asked in the newspapers throughout the manhunt, and it had not been answered to the satisfaction of those who had watched 9 divisions of the Metropolitan Police fail to apprehend a single fugitive who had done nothing more sophisticated than keep walking south and east until he was out of the district. The question would require an institutional answer. The answer would come, but not yet. Not until the summer. The sentence having been pronounced, Daniel Good was removed from the court to await his execution at Newgate Prison. The date fixed for the hanging was Monday, the 23rd of May, 1842. Between the conclusion of the trial on the 13th of May and the date of execution, a period of 10 days elapsed. During those 10 days, the press continued to report on the case and on the man awaiting his death. The broadside trade, which had for decades produced printed sheets documenting the crimes, trials, confessions, and executions of condemned persons and sold them on the streets of London at a penny apiece, was active. A broadside titled, "Life, Trial, and Execution of Daniel Good, the Murderer," was produced by H. Paul, printer of 22 Brick Lane, Spitalfields, London, and distributed through the ordinary channels of the street trade. A copy of this document survives at the present day in the British Criminal Broadside Collection held at Kent State University. Libraries in the United States. Having been preserved through the particular attention that American institutions have given to this class of ephemera, the broadside trade was in 1842 the principal popular medium through which condemned persons passed from the newspaper into something closer to legend. Daniel Good was given that treatment in the days before his death. The Illustrated London News, which had been established only weeks before the discovery of the murder, published a portrait of Good in its second ever issue. Dated the 21st of May, 1842, 2 days before the execution took place. The significance of this publication extends beyond its immediate subject. The Illustrated London News was the first illustrated weekly newspaper in Britain, a new form of journalism in which engraved images accompanied the printed word in a combination that would define popular press culture for the remainder of the century. Its second issue was given over in part to one of the most notorious criminal cases of the year. The relationship between the illustrated press and the sensational criminal case was established in this instance in the very earliest weeks of the new publication's existence. Good's portrait, distributed across the readership of the Illustrated London News 2 days before his death, ensured that his face was familiar to a public that had already been following his case for more than 6 weeks through the printed word. The execution was carried out on Monday, the 23rd of May, 1842, at Newgate Prison. The hanging was public, conducted outside the prison walls, in the manner that had been standard practice in England for centuries and would continue to be standard practice until the abolition of public executions in 1868. A crowd assembled to witness the proceedings. Public executions in London in 1842 drew crowds of considerable size, and the execution of Daniel Good, whose case had occupied the press and the public for the better part of 2 months, was attended accordingly. Contemporary reports describing the crowd's conduct at the execution record that those assembled assailed the condemned man with considerable hostility. The atmosphere was not that of a spectacle enjoyed with detachment, but of a crowd that had formed a settled view of the man on the scaffold and expressed it with directness. The execution was carried out. Daniel Good died at Newgate on the 23rd of May, 1842, by hanging. He was buried within the precincts of the prison, as was the practice for executed prisoners at Newgate, though the specific burial record has not been confirmed in the sources recovered. The death of Daniel Good closed the criminal proceedings that had begun with P.C. Gardner's discovery at Putney Park Lane on the 6th of April. It did not close the public conversation about what the case had revealed. The Times, which had been the most prominent and sustained chronicler of the entire sequence of events, had throughout the manhunt given space to commentary on the adequacy of the Metropolitan Police as an investigative body. That commentary did not cease with the execution. The question of how a single fugitive had stayed ahead of 9 divisions of the Metropolitan Police for 10 days to a fortnight, crossing a jurisdictional boundary that had effectively halted the pursuit, was not a question that the execution of the fugitive had answered. It was a question of institutional capacity, and it required an institutional answer. The answer came in stages. On the 14th of June, 1842, Commissioners Richard Mayne and Sir Charles Rowan addressed a formal document to the Home Secretary. The document was titled Memorandum Relative to the Detective Powers of the Police. It set out, in the language of administrative correspondence, the problem the Good case had exposed. The police, the memorandum stated, had in the Good case been unable to maintain effective pursuit of a suspect who had moved beyond the boundaries of the Metropolitan Police District, because the force had no means of getting immediate cognizance of him once he had crossed those boundaries. The memorandum proposed a remedy. 2 detective inspectors and 8 detective sergeants, selected from among the best officers within the force, were to be drawn from their divisional duties and constituted as a new branch of Scotland Yard. These officers would be dedicated to the investigation of serious crime. They would operate in plain clothes. They would work across divisional boundaries. They would, in short, be detectives in the formal and institutional sense of that word, carrying out the work that the Good case had demonstrated could not be done by the existing structure. The memorandum of the 14th of June was the document that created what became known as the detective branch of the Metropolitan Police. The formal announcement of the branch's creation appeared in the Metropolitan Police Internal Police Orders on the 15th of August, 1842, 4 months after the discovery of Jane Jones's remains in the stable at Putney Park Lane. In its final established form, the detective branch comprised 2 inspectors and 6 sergeants, a slight reduction from the 8 sergeants proposed in the memorandum. Inspector Nicholas Pearce, who had been called in by Commissioner Mayne to lead the investigation in the wake of the discovery at Roehampton, was appointed to head the new branch. He was, in this respect, the first Chief of Scotland Yard's detective function. Inspector John Haynes, a 10-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, who had formerly worked as a chemist, served as the second inspector in the branch. Several of the detective sergeants, appointed to the new branch, had been involved in the investigation that had followed the discovery of the murder. The detective branch of 1842 was the first dedicated detective unit in the history of British policing. It is this fact, rather than any particular feature of the Good case itself, that gives the case its claim on British institutional history. Prior to its creation, the Metropolitan Police had no capacity for plainclothes investigative work. The resistance to such a capacity had been cultural as well as organizational. The British public, suspicious of anything that resembled the surveillance and intelligence methods associated with the French police tradition, had regarded plainclothes detective work with mistrust. The parliamentary and public debate around the establishment of the Metropolitan Police in 1829 had been shaped in part by reassurances that the new force would operate openly, in uniform, on the beat, and would not conduct the kind of covert inquiry associated with continental practice. The good case cut through that cultural resistance by demonstrating, in unmistakable terms, the operational cost of its absence. A murderer had walked free for nearly a fortnight because there was no one in the Metropolitan Police whose job it was to pursue a fugitive across a boundary. The memorandum of the 14th of June gave someone that job. The police orders of the 15th of August established the institution. The 8 men of the detective branch, working in plain clothes from Scotland Yard, began their work in the summer of 1842. They were, in terms of number, a tiny addition to a force of several thousand. In terms of function, they represented a structural change in how British policing conceived of its relationship to the investigation of serious crime. The branch would grow in subsequent decades. The detective branch would eventually become the Criminal Investigation Department, established in its modern form in 1878, and the CID in various forms has continued in operation within the Metropolitan Police from that day to the present. The institutional lineage that connects the 8 men appointed to Scotland Yard's plainclothes detective function in August of 1842 to the structures of British criminal investigation as they exist today is unbroken. That lineage begins with the memorandum of the 14th of June, 1842. The memorandum begins with the failure to catch Daniel Good. The failure begins with the discovery of Jane Jones. The cultural persistence of the case rests almost entirely on this institutional consequence, rather than on the person of Jane Jones herself. The broadsides and newspaper coverage of 1842, passed as such coverage, always passed into the archive. The case entered the literature of British policing history in the decades that followed, appearing in accounts of the origins of Scotland Yard's detective function and in histories of the Metropolitan Police written from the mid-Victorian period onward. In the present century, the case has been the subject of sustained scholarly and popular treatment, principally through the research of Dr. Angela Buckley, whose work under the title, The Murder That Created Scotland Yard, represents the most rigorous secondary treatment of the case yet published. The case has been noted by the Tonbridge History Society in recognition of the town's particular role in Good's arrest. It has been discussed in publications concerned with the history of British crime and policing, and it appears in all standard histories of the Metropolitan Police as the formative case in the creation of the detective function. Jane Jones does not appear in those accounts as a person. She appears as an occasion. The case, in the way that it has been remembered and discussed, is the case that created Scotland Yard's detective branch. It is named, technically, for its victim. It is remembered for what it produced in the way of institutional consequence. The woman at the center of it, whose name the case bears, remains almost entirely undocumented as an individual. Her origins are not known. Her family is not known. Her age is not established. Where she was born, where she was raised, what her life had been before the lodging house at Manchester Square in 1839. None of this is recoverable from the surviving record. The record preserves her in a handful of references. As a plump person and rather dark, as a lodger at a particular address, as a woman who lived under a name that was not legally hers, and as the charge in the proceedings against Daniel Good. It preserves her in the medical testimony of Benjamin Ride, in the account of what Ride found when he came to the stable on the 7th of April with the coroner's warrant. It preserves her in the verdict and in the execution that followed the verdict. It does not preserve her as a person. The record is insufficient for that. The burial place of Jane Jones has not been established in any source recovered. Whether the remains that Benjamin Ride examined, the limbless and headless torso recovered from beneath the hay in the stable at Putney Park Lane, were ultimately interred somewhere, and if so, where, is not documented. The record ends before that question is answered. The case of Jane Jones closes the record examined here. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1842. The case became part of the national record. It has not left.